I will always remember the day that she dropped me out of the two-story window. Hi, my name is Marnie Grundman. I'm 57 years old. I live in Montreal, Canada, and I'm going to be sharing my story of surviving a narcissistic family system and living on the streets at the age of 13. I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse, SA, and domestic violence. As a child growing up in abuse, I had no idea that I was being abused because it was my normal. It wasn't until I got out of my family and had some contrast that I realized that the household that I came from wasn't like everybody else's. My earliest memory of abuse is when my mother dropped me out of a two-story window when I was 5 years old. I never even put together that she tried to unalive me because I walked away with 2 broken arms. It actually wasn't until this year that I figured out that it clicked for me that she was actually trying to unalive me. It wasn't just about hurting me. My growing up experience with my mother was always pins and needles. I don't have any memories with relationship to my mother in particular that were happy, that were peaceful, that were safe. Every moment with her was monitoring how she was reacting to me and trying to be a good enough little girl that she would be nice to me and love me, because I knew that the abuse that she was perpetrating, which I didn't realize, of course, at the time was abuse, was because there was something wrong with me. My mother often told me I was damaged goods, that everybody knew I was a liar and that I was sick in the head and that I belonged in a psych ward and people don't understand how she puts up with me. So she made it very clear to me that the way she treated me was my fault, which created an environment for me where I was constantly monitoring her and trying to please her. I didn't understand some of the words my mother was using. When I was around 9 years old, she started to call me. I had no idea what that meant, but I knew it didn't mean something good. I definitely knew that those words weren't good and that I wasn't good. My biological father and my mother divorced when I was 14 months old, and from what I know, he left long before that, and I only saw him once after she dropped me out of the two-story window, and that's when he was signing documents, I'm assuming, to give me over to my grandparents. I came to know him in my adult life much, much later, after I was no longer in a relationship with my mother, and did form a really loving relationship with him, but I didn't have him growing up. I will always remember the day that she dropped me out of the two-story window. My brother, I was around 5 years old. My brother is 10, 11 years old, and they were arguing. She wanted him to go to the store and buy a pack of cigarettes. My brother was saying that it was raining, and my mother told me to put my hand out the window to see if it was raining. She didn't like my answer. It was raining. She came bounding up the stairs. My brother was coming up the stairs, and she goes, check again, lean out further. So I leaned out further with my one arm, and she said, no, check with both arms. And as I put both of my arms out the window, she lifted me up by the feet, and I felt her literally let go of my legs. It was the rain that actually broke my fall. I can remember the sensation of the fall to this day. I can remember the smell in the air. I don't remember, thankfully, impact, but because the ground was softened by the rain, that's probably why I survived. My next memory is of my mother putting me in my blankie into a taxi and taking me to the hospital. No ambulance, no police, no nothing. And then I woke up with casts, and the casts that were from the bottom of my, like in my armpit, all the way down. The only thing I had free fingers and my thumbs on both arms, straight casted for about 8 weeks. I didn't hear my brother have any reaction, and I don't know that he realized she actually let go of me. I came to find out years later that it was intentional more than I realized. Somebody who knew me from the time that I was born, a babysitter that we used to have, told me quite recently that she had sued or threatened to sue the landlords for there not being screens on the windows. So it seems that she actually set that up, and the rain maybe was an excuse for her. It was the right timing, but she set it up for financial gain, which was not unusual for my mother to engage in criminal activity for financial gain. I have 3 stepfathers that passed away out of 5 of her husbands. one of cancer, but still 3 deads. I don't remember what I thought at the time. I remember like I was woozy, so it would have been more after the fact, and I already was trained to be numb and say nothing. My mother was neglecting me from the time that I was really little. The babysitter that I had that used to take care of my brother and I when my mother was, for example, passed out, would come over every day after school and check on me, and she would find me in the crib, not changed, not fed, playing quietly. So I already was groomed to be this very silent, compliant, don't push back little girl. I knew what I needed to do to survive my mother, even at that age. When I came back from running away, that was one. There were only a couple of times that my mother ever told me that she loved me. One was when I came back from running away from home. Social services actually sent me back to her, no questions asked. And when I arrived, she told me that she loved me and she missed me. And my reaction to that was really, like, I was very surprised, because I had always been told by her that if I ever disappeared, nobody would remember me, everybody would forget about me, and nobody would be looking for me. And then the next time that I can recall her telling me that she loved me was when my own daughter was having her babies, and my mother and my daughter at that point in time had a relationship. And so my mother wanted to reunite with me so that she could be a part of my daughter's birth experience. And that time I was no contact with her for 17 years, and her telling me that she loved me after not seeing her for 17 years made me try to have a relationship with her again, because I so desperately wanted my mother to love me. After my mother dropped me out of the 2-story window, the way that I ended up with my grandparents was because they got involved. And as a child, I have no idea what was going on behind the scenes, because nobody was holding her to account. My mother's story that she spun was that I was playing on a toy box, which didn't exist, by the way, that she had told me not to play on, and that it was my fault that I fell out of the window. I end up living with my grandparents as a result of that incident in one way or the other. And that marked the beginning of my grandfather having complete access to me. I think it's also important to note that my grandmother was a functional. So I had 2 very dysfunctional grandparents who I adored and who I didn't know weren't like everybody else's grandparents. And in one way, they were very good and loving to me. But now, fast forward all these years later, I realized the way in which they were loving to me was all about grooming. My grandmother used me as leverage against my mother, as oh, look, I can love this little girl, not like I can't love you because you're not a good little girl. Like, my mother got it from somewhere, right? My grandmother also was the person who lured me into the bed that my grandfather slept in and gave me to him. My grandmother would call me into the bedroom for a love up, which meant cuddles. And I loved cuddling with my grandmother without clothes on, though. And of course, I don't know that that's not normal. She didn't have clothes on. My grandfather didn't have clothes on. I did not have clothes on. She would call me into the bed to give me a love up. She would cuddle me a little bit. I would nuzzle into her, and then she would turn over and go to sleep, and my grandfather would molest me. And when my grandmother would turn over and go to sleep, I would go somewhere else, and I wasn't there. I know my grandfather was touching me. I have some specific memories, but I wasn't there. Because of the way that my mother was with me, I was already really efficient at numbing out, which I now know was disassociation, but I didn't know it at the time. And an interesting thing that all of my family members and even friends that I've crossed paths with now, like later in life, they all say the same thing, that Marnie used to live in an imaginary world. So I lived in that place of, little pretend friends and singing songs and dancing around. Like, that was my normal, and other people noticed it. That I guess it wasn't so normal, right? I didn't confront my mother until I was 26 years old, and she never denied it. I confronted her in a phone call, and at this point in time, I had been in therapy. I was in a really bad place. I was dealing with a lot of memories and a lot of flashbacks, specifically related to the sexual abuse with my grandfather. I told my mother what he had done, and she kept saying, my father, a child molester, never said he's not, or no, or that didn't happen, none of that, but also didn't acknowledge it. And eventually she hung up the phone. I lived in my grandparents' house from about the age of 5 to 9 until my mother showed up with my new stepdaddy that she was already married to. So I was there consistently through those years. And then there were times where after we moved from Montreal to Miami, I would spend the weekend at my grandparents' house. It did diminish over time, maybe because I got older and I was, less attractive to my grandfather, but it never stopped entirely until I ran away. Well, my grandmother brought me into the bed, so my grandmother was present. She would turn over and go to sleep, but she knew that I was still in the bed. And I didn't make that connection for a really, really long time. And interesting, my grandmother used to refer to my mother as my grandfather's favorite, and then would refer to me as my grandfather's favorite, which I think is a very telling way to identify the girls that he was definitely molesting. I mean, I can't prove he was molesting my mother, but it goes to follow that if he's doing it to me, he did it to his own daughters. And as far as telling anyone, I've been the family liar since I was 4 or 5 years old. When the window incident happened, I can remember one of my aunts referring to me as that Marnie, she's always been a liar. To this day, she still refers to me that way. So I already knew that anything that I would say wasn't going to be believed. I knew that I was out of here starting way before 13. So after my mother dropped me out of the 2-story window and I went to live with my grandparents, because I had seen and connected to my father, I started running away to try to find him. So I was constantly running away, and most of the time not getting caught, because I would get home in time for dinner. I knew better than to stay out and end up being in trouble. My real running away, meaning I wasn't running to my father anymore, started when my mother brought me to Miami. And I'd say about 9 or 10 years old, I started running away from home whenever my stepfather was gone. When my mother married really, really loving men. When my stepfather was around, I had some buffer and some protection. But when he wasn't, I frequently ran away. I was known by the police. I was a habitual runaway. By 11, I was really on the radar. At 12 years old, one of the times that I ran away, I stayed out all night. And that's when the crossover began for me, because I survived a whole night. That night, I barely survived. I ended up with a guy who sexually assaulted me. I lost my virginity to him. He kept me throughout the night. He stalked me afterwards. He actually brought me home and stalked me afterwards. I could have been dead. He could have sold me. He could have done whatever he wanted to me. Fortunately for me, he didn't. After that 12-year-old runaway, I ended up going to boarding school, not as a punishment, but because we moved to New York. And having an entire year at boarding school, or 9 months, with no abuse, that's when I started to figure out that not everybody lives the way I had been living. That was my first clue that, oh, you mean people aren't mad at you all the time? People aren't calling you names? People aren't mean to you? People aren't violating your body? It was really like a huge aha for me. I come back from boarding school and my mother plays a little game with me. She knows I have a boyfriend in boarding school. And she says to me, we can't really afford to send you back to boarding school until you graduate. And your boyfriend is going off to university next year. So you'd only have 1 more year with him anyway. And then he's not going to be here. So why don't you stay home and go to school? So either you go to school, which we can't afford, and you stay there for 4 years and you're going to be without your boyfriend, or you come home and he's going to end up going to school in Miami anyway. Well, I chose going to boarding school. Not that I didn't want my boyfriend, but I wanted to be away for those 4 years. And she said, no, you're not going. She sent me to my grandparents' house that night, and that's the night I ran, and I was gone for 3.5 years. Being on the streets was only better than being with my family, in that the people who were abusing me on the streets weren't supposed to love me. So the abuse that my family, my mother in particular, was perpetrating was much more painful to me than anything anybody could do to my body, because of the fact that those other people weren't supposed to love me. And after about a year and a half on the street, so I was 14 and a half, I fell into a job as a cocktail waitress. Now, keeping in mind, this is in Miami in the 1980s during the cowboy era, the Mariel boat lift. There was not a more dangerous time to be on the streets, let alone as a 14-year-old girl. I lived in houses. I know how to cut. I didn't do. That's why I'm alive today. And I fell into a job and I got my first apartment, which didn't stop me from being a victim of abuse. I ended up being trafficked for labor, but it did stop me from being a daily victim of abuse. It stopped me from, ending up having sex so that I could eat and sleep somewhere after going days without food, kind of thing. Life on the streets was horrific. My first month and a half or so I spent living on a park bench. I probably weighed around 90 pounds from times that I went days on end without food. In order to bathe, I would just wash up as best I could in the bathroom sink in a public restroom that was adjacent to where my park bench was. I would sit outside 7-Eleven every day, hoping that somebody would feed me, and lots of times nobody even gave me any change or anything like that. I wasn't the kind of kid who was going to put her hand out or ask for help. I'm still not the kind of adult who puts her hands out or asks for help to some degree. So back then it was even worse. I ended up also living in abandoned buildings. A lot of times they were roach infested, living in apartment complex saunas. Those weren't so bad because they had showers in them. But I was alone and I was isolated and I had no one. And then on the days that nobody would even stop to give me any change, I knew I wasn't even worth feeding. So it was extremely isolating and at night terrifying. When I ran away, I was out. I didn't have any communication with anyone. I changed my name. I didn't want to be found. And then there was a point in time where I remembered my mother's words of, nobody's going to look for you. Nobody's going to care. And there was actually a point in time where I was alone and I was trying to fall asleep and I was cold and I was hungry. And I thought to call home. For a split second there, I was like, I'm going to call home. I'm just going to do it. I'd probably been out there about a year at this point. And then I remembered that my mother told me that everybody would just forget about me. And I really, really genuinely felt that everybody had forgotten about me and they were better off without me. So I didn't call. I was living on the streets for about a year and a half, completely 100% of the time. I mean, other than every now and again finding a place to crash for a day here or a day there, that sort of thing. And then when I was 14 and a half, I found the job as a cocktail waitress. And after that, I was never without a roof over my head again. I was numb more than anything else. When I got off of the streets, because I built this new identity for myself, I really put who I was or who I was born in another compartment and just didn't think about it. I had a whole story that my family had died and that I was on my own, and I lived that story to its fullest. I got pregnant with my little daughter, who's now 40 years old. And I was 17 years old. I had been living with somebody who didn't want to have a baby, and I knew that he was going to force me to not have my baby, and that wasn't an option for me. That was my choice at that time. And so I left him and I ended up working as a live-in nanny, which I was actually sexually assaulted during that time by the person who lived in that house. And I say this because even though I was off the streets, I think it's important to understand that I was still very vulnerable to predators, and predators look for children like me, not just girls. As I was going through this experience, I was also put in touch with family services, I think it was Christian Family Services, and they put me in another house, which was a better situation to some degree. When I had my daughter, because I was 17 and living in the US, there was a requirement by law that they report to my parents. And the way that the social worker manipulated me was to make it seem like if I didn't give up the phone number and everything, they couldn't find a record of me missing, interestingly enough, that I was jeopardizing my keeping my baby. The social worker never asked me why I ran away from home. She just connected me to my mother, who used those words, "I love you." That was actually one of the 3 times, so there were 3 times. And I was ready to go home. I didn't see coming what was going to be coming next. When I got back, my daughter was 10 days old, and after my mother told me she loved me and she missed me, the standard statement that was made across the board by anyone who had an opinion was, "How could you do this to the family? Do you know what you put everybody through?" Nobody asked me how I survived. Nobody asked me if I was okay. Nobody was there for me. I wanted to stay living with one of my aunts who was actually really good to me as a little girl, not the one who called me the family liar. And my mother didn't want that to happen because that would have meant that I got to go to school, that I got therapy, that I got the help that I needed. And it was a threat to her narrative that I was the problem. I was made to go and live with my mother. Now get this, I'm living in my mother's house for a solid week. My belongings were given away 9 months after I moved out, with the exception of a small suitcase of items. My stepfather comes into my room, which is a den, and says, "This isn't really going to work out. We're going to put you in one of your grandfather's apartments because your mother can't handle this." My mother didn't come out of her bedroom a solid week. Her daughter's missing 3.5 years, comes home with her grandchild, and she doesn't come out of that bedroom to connect with either one of us that entire time. My turning point didn't happen for a very long time after that, with the exception of I went and got my GED. My mother tried to sabotage it, but I made it through. I brought my baby with me, and I did it. I got a license to be a home health care aide so I could support my child. But I didn't actually separate truly from my mother until I was 23, and that's when my healing began. To this day, my mother has never said I'm sorry. My brother also calls me the family liar. Nobody in my family acknowledges anything that was done to me. My one aunt asked my son if he believed me that my grandfather did something to me. And at the time, my son was only 13 years old. My son said to her, "What do you think?" And my aunt kind of said, "I think something happened." That is the only acknowledgement I've ever received, and I didn't receive that acknowledgement. Nobody has once come to me and said, "We knew it was your mother," or "We're sorry," or "We're going to go to therapy, we're going to fix it." I begged my mother to go to therapy with me. I wanted to have a relationship with my mother. I was willing to never hear her say the words "I'm sorry" if she would at least show up and just treat me with kindness. That's all I ever wanted from her. It never happened. It's never going to happen. I used to be really angry. I walked around being really angry for a very long time. And there was a turning point for me where I realized that my mother didn't not care that I was angry, that she would love that I was angry, that she would love that she still had emotional control over me. And when I realized that, it's like a switch flipped. And I decided that I was not going to give her one more chunk of my life. So with regard to any feeling for my mother, I'm indifferent. My grandfather, I'm indifferent. My grandmother, I'm processing some emotions around that because I didn't put 2 and 2 together until like about a year ago. This is one of those things where I recognize I'll forever be on a healing journey, because as memories become clearer and my perspective becomes clearer, I'm tying events together. I want to make it also clear, it doesn't rule my life. It's not like I'm going to be healing and sad forever. I'm far from sad. Those things did not make me a better mother. I made me a better mother because I decided that I was not going to expose my children to abuse, and that I was going to do things in the opposite of my mother, which, by the way, is not the best idea. We need to find balance, but it was a better idea than what I had, which was doing what my mother did. I think a lot of my healing is due to the fact that I'm willing to talk about what happened to me. I'm willing to share it, and I'm willing to share it in a way that I no longer feel any shame attached to that. I'm not hiding in the dark anymore, and I don't carry responsibility for their emotions and how they feel about it anymore. And I'm able to put my relationship with myself first. My daughter and my mother had a relationship because my daughter knew my mother up until the time she was 6 years old when I went no contact with my mother. So fast forward years later, my daughter had fond memories of my mother and of my grandmother. And so she formed a relationship with them both. At some point in time, my daughter started to recognize my mother's toxic behaviors and did not appreciate those behaviors. And during this time, I think it's important to mention that my daughter wasn't hiding that relationship. I knew she had it. We had some boundaries in place that my daughter didn't share anything about my life with my mother. I didn't want to know about their relationship unless she needed to lean on me, and that was it. That was all. Eventually, my daughter ended up going no contact with my mother as well. The things that I'm doing now to help ensure that this doesn't happen to other children, to break the cycle of abuse, and to the children it is happening to, that we provide correct intervention, is speaking out. It's sharing my story. I do a lot of fundraising for Covenant House because they're a wonderful home for children who end up on the streets. They have programs that provide a family system for children to actually heal and be productive. And sharing my story in general. I'm also a therapist today. I work with survivors of narcissistic family systems, specifically and exclusively. And I help people to be able to break the cycles of abuse, which doesn't always mean going no contact. Sometimes it means learning how to navigate certain relationships, but also having that power to decide in their own hands.